Welcome to 5D University, and today's topic is what is the ego? So if you guys watched my video on what is the ascension, and I talked about the transition from the third dimensional state to the fourth dimensional state, and ultimately to the fifth dimensional state. And so part of this transition is in the third dimensional state, we live inside of a matrix. And I know that there's a lot of different perceptions on what the matrix is and da-da-da. But what we really just need to know is that the third dimension is limited thought, limited perception, limited awareness. So we talked about how in the third dimension, all pretty much exist in the ego programmed mind. And this encapsulates limited thought, linear time, limited perception, all of those things. We can only see about 1 to 5% of all energy in existence. We work in linear ways. We have very little awareness because here in the third dimensional realm, information can be manipulated so easily, right? And in the upper realms, nothing can be manipulated. There are no lies or, you can't hide something in the fifth dimensional realm because everyone is connected to source and everyone is connected to universal truths and everyone is connected to collective consciousness. So everything is you're aware of everything. You have the full awareness. Our intuition is completely connected to the quantum field, which tells us all truths through our heart. So that's the difference of how we have such a limited ability here in the third dimensional realm. And so as we talk about the transition out of the third dimensional state, we are also talking about the transition out of the ego programmed mind. And someone who talked a lot about this was Wayne Dyer. And he labeled the ego as edging God out. And that's a perfect description of what the ego does. So the ego programmed mind is basically the same thing as the fight or flight mechanism. This is part of the lower brain. This is part of the programming that was specifically put in to the collective consciousness in order to keep us in a state of amnesia, in order to keep us in a state of lower thought, of limited thought, and of illusion. And so that programming is passed on from generation to generation to generation. It is literally ingrained in the DNA, and I briefly talked about that in the last video, of the 10% of the DNA that is actually able to be decoded is because it follows a linear pattern. It is the programming that is in the DNA. The 90% of the junk DNA is the God consciousness, and it cannot be decoded by linear thought, and you have to be able to have full consciousness to actually be able to understand the way it functions, because it is going to function at a quantum level and not a linear level. So the ego program mind, edging God out, it is belief systems. Okay, the programmings are all based in belief systems. They are based in wounding that we accumulate through all of our lifetimes lived here in this realm, and trauma. So trauma, wounding, and programmings, which are belief systems that are developed, they are passed down through the genetic lines. And the programmings all stem from fight or flight, survival mechanisms. Fear is the root of that, and fear is the opposite of love. So we exist in a fear paradigm and also a pain and suffering paradigm. So the ego program mind is a product of the fight or flight, fear, and survival mode, and it is also the product of the pain and suffering paradigm, which leads to wounding and trauma. So these are deeply ingrained defense mechanisms and programming that is, it is, I won't say it's challenging to break out of, because I don't believe that we should view anything as, oh, it's hard to do this, it's hard to break out. It's not hard, but it does take a dedication. It does take a commitment to the self to walk this path. And so part of exiting the third dimensional state is dissolving the ego programmed mind. And so the ego programmed mind can present in so many different ways. Again, this is going to be linked to pain and suffering, which creates wounding and trauma, which is how we develop our defense mechanisms, right? And our fight or flight and our survival and fear, which creates limited thought, which creates limited perception. And so I'm going to just read through the list, and we do have this on our website if you're interested. We have a list of all the ego programs as they were identified, and how to dissolve them and kind of how to break them down. And we do have a full workbook on that. But I'll just read through these just to briefly give you an idea of how the ego programmed mind kind of keeps us in a state of illusion, and it keeps us in a state of pain and suffering. And that's the biggest difference, is as we're leaving the third dimensional state and entering into the fourth and fifth dimensional state, we're leaving behind fear and fight or flight, and we're moving into trust and surrender, and we're dissolving the pain and suffering so that we can enter joy and miracles and harmony and co-creation and all of the beautiful concepts that we know exist, and they just exist in a higher state of being. So the programmings of the ego, we have lack of wisdom. And remember, wisdom comes from walking the path. Wisdom comes from actually going through an experience and learning from it, right? So without experience, we can never really develop wisdom. We don't learn by what others tell us. We learn from experiencing it. And so the next one is lack of experience, and those two intertwine. And lack of experience leads to lack of wisdom. When we are in such a limited way of being, a limited way of existing, it prevents us from learning things. It prevents us from expanding. We stay stuck in a box. We then have lack of compassion, huge ego programming. We really have been so disconnected from our hearts, because remember, the ego is the opposite of love. It's fear, pain, and suffering, which is the complete opposite of love, which is the heart. So we've lacked a lot of compassion, and we're in a realm of punishment and revenge and just retribution. And it's very harsh to the soul. We have lack of passion. Passion is a divine quality. It is our divine inner spark of source. We have lack of perception. Again, limited perception that comes with being in this realm. We only see things from a very limited scope. We don't see the whole picture. So because we lack perception, we think we know how things work. We think we know the truth, but we don't, because we're only seeing one little tiny grain of sand compared to the big picture of the entire beach, right? Lack of integrity. And this is integrity of the soul. Integrity of the soul is when you are in integrity with what your soul is calling for you to do. Integrity with your intuition, integrity with your values and what your higher purpose is. Lack of honor, lack of honoring ourselves, lack of honoring others, lack of honoring the sacredness of life, treating things as very dispensable. Lack of empathy, huge one in the collective. Lack of feelings, again, huge disconnection from the heart. Lack of self-love. Unworthiness, ignorance, which is really ignoring love. It is ignorance when we ignore what love is telling us through our hearts. And ignorance is sometimes there's, we don't know what we don't know, right? We're ignorant of something, but there's a lot of willful ignorance in this realm, and people choosing to put their head underneath the sand. because they don't want to face something. And so that is a huge programming as well. Arrogance, attachment, deep attachments to people, places, and things. Everything in creation is always flowing. It's always moving and it's flowing, but we become stagnant and attached, and we want to keep everything the same. We don't want to let anything go so something new can come. We don't want to flow with the energy. We don't want to allow things. We want to keep everything, hoard it, attach to it, lock it down. Taking of energy, taking of things, taking of resources from the earth, from humanity. Taking is a huge energy of the ego. Incubus, succubus energy, which is just the lower damaged energies of the sacral, which is a lot of lust, which is literally taking energy through the sexual life force, which is meant to be honored and divine and very sacred. We have trauma and wounding, which is a product of the ego. They go hand in hand. Of course, we can't avoid in this 3D realm. Of course, we're going to have wounding. We're going to have harsh experiences. We're going to take on a certain level of trauma in every life. But in every life, the lesson is always to come back to love, to forgive, to let go, to overcome. And so the trauma really develops when we refuse the healing, right? And so that's kind of a whole nother video in and of itself. But trauma and wounding, it is not that these things don't occur. It's simply, what do we do with them? Do we heal them? Do we forgive them? Or do we fester in them? Do we hold on to them? Do we make it a part of our identity, which then further brings us into pain and suffering? It's all about how we respond. Childish behavior, robotic habits and behavior, big part of the ego program mind, just 9 to 5, doing the same routine. You know, the 9 to 5 was created by the mind. It was created by the ego, because only the ego would seek to work in such a robotic structure. Hatred of the masculine or feminine, and we all have this very deeply within us. We were basically pitted against one another, when really we all have internal masculine and feminine energy that is meant to be loved, honored, and harmonized. But because we basically have a battle going on internally with ourselves, it represents as the external battle between masculine and feminine, and a hatred which is built up again from trauma and wounding. Preference to pain and suffering. We can become addicted to pain and suffering in this realm because it's all we know. Until we heal and we rise above and we understand that there's a purpose to all of these events and experiences, we will stay attached to pain and suffering. Superiority, ego programming, thinking you know better, not being open to continuing to learn. A lot of the mind, the ego programmed mind, thinks it knows everything from such a limited perception, and it is not open to other things. And so this leads to very rigid thinking. This leads to very dogmatic beliefs. Entitlement, self-importance, which is when you're only concerned about the self and you don't serve the highest good of all. You only serve yourself. Delusions of grandeur. A lot of people thinking that they are, this happens a lot with fame and power and money. Fantasy, which is being stuck in the mind and not actually tapping into the true intuition. It also just can be where people sometimes escape their third dimensional experience through thoughts and fantasy. So it can kind of go either way. Needing to be right, huge ego programming, controlling, ungrateful, no accountability, always blaming somebody else's fault. We're all one, so it's all the same energy. Gossip, jealousy, vanity, lack of beauty is when we do not see the beauty within ourselves or in others or everything around us. Desire, validation, seeking validation, wanting to be followed, wanting to be basically like worshipped in a way, being fake, reverence of the mind, which we see a lot of in our daily world. We have put science on a pedestal almost as being God now. It's this deep reverence of the mind and linear thinking and analytical thinking, and just completely kind of taking us away from the true inspiration and innovation and intuition of the multidimensional self. Justification, procrastination, bargaining, which is like, oh, I'll do this for you if you do this for me. It's not unconditional. It's very, oh yeah, maybe I'll help this person, but they owe me. That's a bargaining. Poverty consciousness, lack. Addiction to sugar is actually one of the ego programmings. And this is not to say don't ever have sugar. We're, never going to say that. Everything in moderation. But if there's an addiction to sugar, it is a programming because sugar actually feeds the mind very directly. Linear thinking. Acting and identifying of things from the outside. So being overly attached to the external and not really having clear connection to your internal self, but instead looking at everything from an external perspective. We have some other conditionings, such as being impatient, being easily distracted and all over the place is a product of the mind. Quitting is a product of the mind. The soul never gives up, never quits. Inconsistency, huge ego programming, huge. Being consistent is like the main enemy of the ego. Complaining, laziness, complacency, being reactive. And then, of course, we have cultural programmings that run in all cultures and nations, their own set of belief systems, which are programmings that are basically just passed on. And so that's why each culture is very different. And they all have their own programmings. Like it's their belief about something and the way things are is very much tribal and comes through the DNA lines. And then we have spiritual and superego. So spiritual ego can happen where once you've awakened and you kind of enter the spiritual journey, and we've all battled this at some point or another, was you start to get into having a spiritual ego where you think you know the way everything works and you've awakened and you're very enlightened, and it's kind of been rampant within the spiritual community. Where they believe that the way things work and who they're channeling and who they're connecting with, they have all the answers, and it just kind of creates a little bit of separation because all of us are on the same journey together, and we're ultimately sharing the truths that have been revealed to us, and to take that all into account, that we're all pieces of the puzzle and we all do hold key truths to make up the whole. And superego this can go one of two ways. So superego could be someone who's just has an extremely inflated ego programmed mind. And all of the programmings I mentioned are just super heightened. The other aspect of the superego is just when you have incessant thought loops, like just incessant mind chatter, which can lead to heightened states of anxiety and paranoia and things like that. And that just means you just don't have any sort of management of being able to stay in the heart, being able to center and ground and kind of allow those thought loops to quiet down so that you can get to a place of clarity. So everyone has struggled with all of these programmings at some point. These programmings are universal. And it's just to have an awareness of them so that we can start to see them. Because as we start to see them within ourselves, we can then transform them. And so the best guidance I have as far as the ego is just to get familiar with the programmings, to start identifying them. So that we realize when they come up and we can say, oh, there it is. Because remember, awareness transforms into consciousness. So every time we become aware of something that we weren't aware of before, we get a heightened state of consciousness. Our consciousness expands. So when we start to become aware of our programmings and others' programmings, we expand in our consciousness, and we're now able to more easily dissolve those programmings from within us and to enter a higher state of being. So I'll do a separate video on the divine traits of Source, which are going to be what we are anchoring in as we deprogram the mind and we start to embody more of the divine traits, which are our true selves. This is our galactic inheritance and what all in creation embody, just in unique ways. So the biggest guidance for dealing with the ego programmings, like I said, is first just get aware of them. And again, you can go to our website and look through all the programmings and how they typically present to get more familiar with them. And then we also recommend ego death ceremonies, which we also have an example guide on our website of how to dissolve the ego, and using an ego death ceremony is a great tool. Because you can't just sit around contemplating, how do I dissolve this programming and how do I dissolve that programming? And so the ego death ceremony kind of just helps facilitate it all. And it really is just you sitting down and writing out a ceremony of, I putting the intention to dissolve these programmings from within me. And you can write all of them down if you want, or you can pick out the ones you feel that are really core for you, however you'd like to do it. And then you simply burn that ceremony, and it allows and assists with releasing those programmings. And they will come up to test you. This is something that happens on our journey, is like we seek to dissolve or release some part. And remember, this is deeply, deeply ingrained into the human consciousness. And this is deeply ingrained into the DNA. So this takes time. But simply when we put the intention and we facilitate the release and dissolvement of these programmings, it allows us to make a quantum leap. But they will get brought up for testing. So, if I write an ego death ceremony and I'm seeking to release lack of compassion and lack of empathy and lack of feeling, I'm definitely going to get tested then with some sort of experience that's going to require me to show compassion and empathy and feeling. So just know that, and it's not personal. This is just the game that we play. The external gives us a clue of what to work on internally. And so when you do these ceremonies, they do often bring things up for testing, but that's a great mile marker and sign that you are going through the transformation process. And there's tons of tools and techniques as well that you can use in your transformational journey and your spiritual journey. And I'll do a video on kind of the tools and techniques that we like to use, but ego death ceremony is great for assisting specifically with the dissolving of these programmings. So if there's any questions, feel free to comment. Thank you guys for sharing the material that resonates with you. And if anyone's looking for additional resources and guidance or assistance, you can check out our homepage at 5dfulldisclosure.org, and we'll be back soon.